first couple of things I wanted to ask you about the book. So it's 5 months since the release, and it's been a labor of love for you and Bob, like 6 years in the making. How does it feel?
It really makes you feel certainly gratified and grateful too. Awards like recognition, like the Next Big Idea Club, it's wonderful. But as you know, there's always an element of a fluke in them. But I certainly feel happy that this book got that kind of recognition. I feel all the more happy because Bob's just retired from Stanford University. And so this is a nice kind of like send off for him too,
I didn't know that.
if you
Okay.
will. Yeah, so if you will, so it's a nice kind of way to end 40 wonderful years of contribution to the profession and, of course, to Stanford. So I feel very happy. So on the one hand, things like the Next Big Idea Club are good, but what really warms the cockles of my heart is when somebody, as somebody who read the book, they looked at me and they said, when I read the book, I felt heard. That is like, both Bob and I feel very gratified. And, Bob's the better writer compared to me for this audience. And, he certainly deserves a good bit of credit for, obviously this response. So we iterate over and so forth. But I think when somebody says, I feel heard, the book has kind of landed. And when you teach the material, particularly to executives, you instantly see the connection and the resonance.
That is so true. So I have your autographed early
Yeah.
copy. I also got my hardcover copy of my own personal versions, which I can actually like dog ear and I wouldn't feel bad about writing all over it. And I also got the audiobook. And it was almost like an emotional roller coaster because as you're describing the examples of bad friction, my growth as a leader kind of spoke where I made those mistakes. And then you describe the examples of good mistake, good friction. I'm like, oh, so I finally course corrected. Like I course
That's
corrected.
nice. That's nice. I'm glad you sort of sensed your own evolution in the book.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I feel like I like for as compact of a read it is, like it packs such a big punch because there's so much to unpack in the book. But here's my question for you. What's been the like every time something becomes a movement, which I feel like subtraction and friction, good friction is becoming, are there instances where you've heard and it's made you wince or like, oh, that's not what we meant when we said this or add that?
I love your reference to a movement, and that's kind of what we wanted to do really with the book. Our goal in the book, TJ, was how do you give people a vocabulary to talk about their experiences in organization? And not just a vocabulary to describe what is happening to them, but also a set of tools to kind of address it. And what we wanted was as many people as possible to join the movement to make work less of a grind, because that's really the problem. Now, you ask, have there been unexpected things in either direction? The amazing thing is you recruit people to the movement in part by teaching them, and certainly in the Stanford classrooms, when people respond to the material in the book, they come up with like fascinating extensions and ideas. I could give you a long laundry list, but I'm going to give you two mischievous ones, just so that the audience listening to all of this can kind of contribute their own ideas too. So I remember I was teaching in a class of 60 chief operations officers. We spoke about subtraction, and I said, hey, subtraction is not one and done. It's like mowing the lawn. And then I asked them, is anybody mowing the lawn in your company? Nobody raised a hand except one young woman. And she looked at me and said, in my company, we're trying to do it, Professor. I said, how? She said, well, I'm the COO and I'm part of the executive committee that meets every Friday for an hour. And she said, we devote about 15 minutes or so to something called a ridiculous. Now what is in the ridiculous? Crazy, stupid things that the companies do. Now, you can imagine if the executive committee is paying attention to the ridiculous every week, the rank and file presumably also are paying attention to the ridiculous and taking all of these things out when they don't need to be there. That's sort of how you mow the lawn. It's not like a project. It's something, as you can imagine, you can do that regularly. And now here's another gem. Now, this is a mischievous gem, and I want to be careful, but nonetheless, let me share this. So, in another executive education context, I was asking people in a multinational company that shan't be named for obvious reasons. I said, describe your day to me. When I began the class like that, and they look at me and say, every day, professor, we meet for 6 hours. Every day.
Okay.
And I just said, oh my God, is there a meeting free day? I asked them. And they look at me and say, Sunday, professor.
Wow.
Can you imagine that, TJ? Now, on the other hand, when I was talking about leaders being trustees of time, one very mischievous executive told me, Professor, my leader wastes our time. I said, your time only? He said, no, not just my time, but the time of a lot of other people. So I said, what do you call this boss of yours? And TJ looks at me with a grin and says, don't mention my name or my company's name, but I can tell you what we call our boss. We call him a clock sucker.
Wow. So no love lost there.
you know, so you can see all of these are reactions. Now, you point out what are some things that make us wince. Let me give you an example. So we talk about how at AstraZeneca, a group of people launched a movement that saved the company 2 million hours, roughly 1148 FTEs.
Hmm.
And we pose the question, and we talk about it as mowing the lawn. And then we ask people, hey, do you think you can actually mow the lawn in your company? Where you wince is when teams say, oh, 2 million hours, we've got 30,000 employees. Let's divide 2 million hours by 30,000 employees. So you get like a per employee target, and then you say, okay, we're going to reduce meetings from 30 to 25 minutes, and all these changes will produce this. And you kind of say, look, this is not an accounting thing. What you really want to do when you want to save 2 million hours is you really look at the mistakes that are constantly repeated in a company. See, it's
Oh.
okay if a company that's scaling makes a mistake for the first time, TJ. But if you keep repeating the mistake, I mean, isn't there a problem there? I mean, aren't you wasting time? I mean, this is like the supreme form of wasting time, right? I mean, you're doing the same goddamn thing when it's not working. So you have to fix things like that, is what we tell them, not do these kind of like division and then allocation, and don't get seduced by the arithmetic of subtraction. Get instead focused on what are the mistakes that we are repeating, where are we actually adding so much drag that we need to take all of that out. So it's not like a simple arithmetical exercise, and that's kind of what is disappointed. And when people have done that in front of me, I immediately call them out. And I said, that's not the spirit of subtraction. I said, is this how you achieve your KPIs?
Yeah. That's a good point. Like, yeah, and the point of doing it when it's happened just once is you can come across as very reactive, where oh, you made a mistake, so I'm going to cut this process, and an unintended consequence is you
Right.
end up just people not taking risks and trying new things.
That's right. That's right. That's right. So what you want to do is you want people to kind of step outside of their cocoon a little bit, But anyway, that's kind of been the reaction. But in general, when we talk about time poverty and, when we talk about people having just the scraps of themselves for their family after work, my goodness, it really kind of, it hits my solar plexus, it hits their solar plexus too.
And I actually did want to talk about the family time. Like you talk about so many ways to slow yourself down. And I had a few, like what for me takeaway was workaholics and workaholism is one way where you get bad friction when you're not taking breaks and thinking through and just doing not just not thinking about work, but actively doing things that you're supposed to do. It's actually creating that friction because if the work needs you to be there 5 to 7 days a week, 80 hours a week, that means something is broken, right? And this is what I wanted to talk to you about, like work-life balance as a way to create good friction, where
Yeah,
say take the time to spend with your family, go to the ball game,
yeah, So, the way I sort of think about it is the following. Often people think of work and family as two competing priorities, if you will, on time, or two competing demands on time. And essentially, they leave the balance to the individual. You figure it out. And, but the problem is work-life balance isn't a simple matter of time allocation, right? It's not like I'm going to work 7 hours and I'm going to devote 7 hours to work and some hours to sleep and the rest of the time to my family or whatever it is. What's most important is what's the quality of the time in both
Exactly.
cases. So, if you exhaust people with bullshit work where they don't feel significant, they haven't had an impact, they feel kind of drained. What happens when they go to work? When they go home, they become a vegetable.
Yep.
And if you become a vegetable, can you have a conversation with anybody at home? Your partner at home? Probably not. And you just want the whole world to do shit for you. And everybody is going through the same thing. Nobody has the bandwidth to do a lot of shit for you.
Right.
And so what's kind of important is where I sort of feel a sense of discomfort is in the US, it seems to me we psychologize problems and sort of make it the responsibility of individuals to fix them when the problems, frankly, are much more systemic from the very nature of work. At least
Correct.
the way, I mean, do you need to create organizations where people meet 6 hours a day for meetings like, what kind of life is that?
Yeah. I'll give you one personal perspective. I used to hate it when reports were due, weekly reports. I'm a big fan of report writing because it's a good way to audit your own work. But what I didn't like was due on Friday, end of day Friday. I'm like, I know not a single person is going to read it Friday night. I don't.
It's funny you mentioned this. I was teaching a group of executives in New York some time ago, and I asked the president or the ex-president of the company, I said, come and talk to us about your experience with all these reports. And he's a smart guy, and he quickly narrated how there were so many reports in the company. So he took a big meeting room, put all the reports together, and basically asked people to say, who actually reads these reports and who uses them, and you have to sign, and it was amazing. They just quickly realized a lot of the reports, nobody was reading them, nobody was using them. They said, why are we doing this? Now, see, those are very simple ways in which you can actually subtract and get rid of things. So, but at the same time, remember, we need to also put in good friction too.
Mhm.
So these days, as a result of writing the book, my own life and the way I manage things has changed. I never accept work meetings on the weekend.
Wow. Okay. But it's also interesting that that means even you have to work on the weekends because somebody decided whatever they wanted to work was not.
That's the thing. And then you kind of say, no, I don't want to do this on the weekend. Lots of people come from India. Hey, can we meet? And, I just say, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I don't do like weekend meetings.
Correct.
And they
Yeah.
get kind of surprised. And then you look at them and say, look, you need to kind of erect a little fence around your weekend. I mean, if you allow that to be taken away, like, I don't understand.
Yeah. And you come to Monday morning and you don't dread Monday morning if you take the weekend off.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Speaking of reports, writing, one of the takeaways, at least I got from like the part that you go about like writing reports. First of all, I want to know when you took that memo that you got from the chancellor's office or forget, did you get any flack for it? But you made a.
No, not really. I think Bob actually wrote to the provost, and the provost wrote back. But nonetheless, I think people were kind of alerted to, what the consequences of such behavior were, loading people with all of this and, so forth. So, but I do want to make a point about writing, since you asked about it, and that is writing. What people don't realize is writing is a very powerful way in which we think. See, most of us consider thinking to be a verb, an activity you do by itself. But thinking is an adverb. You do it in conjunction with another activity. Like you think when you write, when you speak, when you read, when you compose a memo, all those kinds of things. And so writing, therefore, is like a very important form of thinking. And if you don't write well, it would mean to me that, some portion of your thinking is stunted. It doesn't matter what language it is. It could be English, it could be math, it could be like whatever, but like Basically, the very act of writing is a very powerful way in which you can actually think.
Yeah, and I did want to bring that up because like I felt like good memo writing is a very powerful way to
Yeah.
think, but also be communicative. Like I just read this morning that NVIDIA founder, he wants his email, he likes emails to be no more than 6 sentences. And if it's more than 6 sentences, you have to talk. And that's really good. And also in these days, because just because a 3 word prompt to chat GPT gives you 50 words back, doesn't mean you should copy paste all the 50 words and put it in there. You should think and figure out what wants to say. But like, are there like, so would you recommend that every leader should spend some time at least getting trained on writing well? Like I don't think unless I don't think anyone is born with it. You have to work at it.
I think the way you get better at writing is it's learning through doing. The more you write, the better you become. Bob, for example, really taught me how to write for a managerial audience, And his rule of thumb, which is a wonderful rule of thumb, is, when you write a paragraph, you immediately have to allow the reader to construct a visual image instantly. And so that is kind of the way you write, because what you want the reader to do is not just consume your book, but actually join you in the adventure of friction fixing in the book, So they need to visualize, they need to imagine like the things that you just kind of went through when you were reading the book and saying, I remember doing all these bad friction mistakes, but I remember doing some of the good friction stuff too. That's exactly the kind of conversation we want to create in the heads of people. So reading, therefore, is actually an act of conversation, if you will. It's not like you just sort of sit and like take a book and you kind of read. You're having a conversation with yourself. And that's kind of what the authors are helping you to have. And in order to do that, it needs to be visual.
And was that one of the things that you realized for writing for a managerial audience?
Completely. Because when you write for a technical audience, it's kind of all English that looks like asphalt, it's all standard, there's jargon. And part of what you really need to do is you really need to de-jargonize and make it super, super simple.
And I love your term. Like I think I've seen jargon monoxide used so often through the vernacular now. What I also like is, speaking of managerial talk, the book is written like we talk, at least in the West.
Exactly.
Yes.
It has to be written like that. Otherwise, you use all these words that nobody understands, and you confuse people. It's kind of pointless, right? So you need to make them as clear and as simple as sort of possible.
Yeah. I do want to go back into some of the management because I'm thinking through where I can apply this book and where some of my clients can apply this book.
Yeah.
What was really interesting is you talked about having one friction fixer, a DRI, who's responsible for friction fixing, which is almost opposite of every situation I walked into, where
Right.
we have a committee that meets
Right.
and then we decide what to cut, what to not.
Yeah.
It becomes like an anti-pattern.
Right. I'm kind of surprised that you sort of saw that inference. We do talk about DRIs, but I think we also talk about the limitations of DRIs. Okay. See, part of the problem is, so suppose I make you the DRI in charge of friction fixing. What have I done? Of course, you're responsible, but essentially, I have outsourced my need to even think about friction. Is that good for the organization? I don't think so. So what you need is, and to go back to the wonderful construct you introduced much earlier in our conversation, what you need are essentially activists in a movement. And the point is, activists aren't like a special class of people. You and I have the activist in ourselves. And what we need to do is we need to create the conditions under which the activist in as many employees rises to the surface so that we can actually mow the lawn. That's kind of the way you do that. You don't kind of say, oh my God, the way we're going to mow the lawn is we're going to create a team and they're going to go off and do all this. You may decide to do that, but isn't it much better for a customer service representative who's dealing with the customer to quickly, while in the course of the conversation with the customer or right after, tag a bunch of rules that got in the way? And hundreds of customer service agents are doing that. At the end of the day, you see what are all the rules that have been tagged, and you can quickly streamline them. So that's kind of what we sort of think of as friction fixing. No, it's not like an elite activity of like one person, or it's not specialized in that sense.
Yes. So just to counter that a little bit, it is not an elite activity, but this role has to rely on influence versus authority. So
Yes.
you want someone who's charismatic enough and convincing enough to say, okay, we need to do this, guys.
Or you need somebody sensible. You don't need charisma that much of the time either. Let me give you an example. The other day in this particular company, they came up with one item on the ridiculous. What was the item? We have a shitload of meetings to talk about customers, but none of those meetings actually feature a customer. Now, do you really need a charismatic? You know what? We can cut a lot of these meetings off. Maybe we need to have fewer meetings, but we need to make sure the customers are in the meeting. It's much better. Now, it's that kind of like simplicity we are kind of interested in. And I think, don't get me wrong, charisma helps. But, you know, I wouldn't say that charisma is a sufficient or at times even a necessary condition. What you need is you need common sense, you need compassion, you need generosity, you need to be able to understand what is happening to the other person. You don't need to be like a great genius to do all of this. Do you really need a genius to kind of go and tell a company, oh my God, for everything you do, there are 20 people who need to sign off on something? Why do you need so many pairs of eyes? What's that going to do for you?
I feel you've just given me a job description of how to select somebody for this role, because you may not need a DRI, but you definitely need someone who can, like, to your point, have common sense, the ability to empathize, and just say, why are we doing this, guys? Without
Yeah, and asking questions. That's the most important thing.
And also realizing that the change comes from all of us, like speaking up and saying, why are we doing this, is common. I'll go back to an example I had, and it stuck with me because I've actually used it in the M&A deals that I'm responsible with, where you told in class that one of your case studies, the first thing they did when they acquired a plant was give every employee, no matter where they were in the structure, their own business cards, because it could sense of belonging, to get a sense of belonging. It cost the company nothing, maybe 30 cents for a pack of 100 business cards, but you suddenly have the sense of belonging. And that stuck with me, and believe it or not, I've used it, and I've had both the acquirer and the acquiree say, why are we doing this, why are you focused on business cards? I'm like, you don't understand. Like, using another analogy you brought up frequently, which is, you guys are focused on the wedding, I'm worried about the marriage.
Yeah, exactly.
um,
Exactly. That's exactly right. That is
are
exactly
there
right.
are there other, like, other, it could be for the book, but other examples you've heard since then about like little things like that have this outsized effect that cost nothing other than just a common sense approach of looking at things?
So one thing that I increasingly talk about when I teach is, wouldn't it be nice if in every company you have something called the prime directive? So what's the prime directive? The prime directive is for every employee, irrespective of level, function, and location. What's the idea behind the prime directive? You want people to be on the same page together. Most of all, the purpose of the prime directive is to tell people you don't need to wait. You can take initiative. So what's a good example of a prime directive? The example that I love, Bob loves it too, and I've had Todd Park in class along with John Lilly and Sujay Jaswa. Todd Park used to be the chief technology officer in the Obama administration, and along with his brother Ed, and another wonderful guy called DJ Patil, who used to be the chief data officer in the Obama White House, they actually created a company called Devoted Health. And it's a fully integrated healthcare operation with their own insurance, doctors, and they have 70 to 100 employees, and they focus on patients 65 and older. And the idea is to make them healthier in the short run, even though that might mean you might have to spend a little bit more money to save more money in the long term. This company is growing very fast, 70 to 100 employees. And what's interesting is Todd Park's prime directive to all 70 to 100 employees is, when you make a decision about a patient, pause and ask yourself, what would you do differently if this patient were your mother or father?
Wow.
See the reaction. What does that do for you immediately? You're a devoted health employee. This is your prime directive. What does it make you think of instantly?
Like it gives me a holy shit moment. It's like better get this right. And
Yeah. So what's interesting is the beauty of this is it puts everybody on the same page.
yeah,
You can take initiative, but the best thing is you don't need to educate people about this. Do you need to train people how to take care of a patient like you would your mother or father? Like what you would do with your mom and dad. You don't need education. What you need is you need to scale their belief in this prime directive. And how do you scale belief? Not by the boss repeating it all the time, but if you have a story bank where you actually have, employees encounter 10, 12 stories every day of frontline people in the company doing this, then you're going to believe this more, right? And then you would do the same thing too. Am I making sense here?
yes, I'm taking notes. It's absolutely
Yeah, so that's like another simple but powerful thing we kind of talk about. Yet another idea we talk about is this ridiculous. So, it reduces everything down to simple things. And so people say, do we need a committee to kind of get together a ridiculous? Why do you need to think of a committee all the time is what I ask them. Don't you hire people? Why don't you make constructing a ridiculous part of the onboarding process? New employees come and say, what's this crazy shit going on here? All that ought to be on the ridiculous. They're going to look at everything with fresh eyes. You and I might not have those fresh eyes, particularly if we worked in the company for a long time.
when you brought that up, and I actually felt like almost validated because when I was doing this, when I in my previous company, at the 30-day mark, we had check-ins to 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. And one of the requirements of the job of the check-ins with a new employee was tell us what we should change. And I had a lot of friction to why are we asking that? I'm like, because their fresh perspective will last all of 5 minutes before they become part of the bureaucracy. And you want that right now. And they're like, why are you doing this? Like, what would you change? So we can use that feedback. And then who knows if that becomes their first project saying, oh, you didn't like the way we're doing this one outreach? Well, guess what? That's your first project when you're in the company. And it was very useful because it creates a sense of ownership. Another huggyism, if I might call it, which is your culture is when what happens when no one's watching is another thing that I've remembered, which is,
Yeah, exactly. That is exactly what it is. It's not compliance behavior that defines your culture. That's exactly right. That is exactly right.
So I do want to talk about two people that show up on your book. One is, of course, Peter Drucker. And in the last 4 years, I've kind of rediscovered the genius that was Peter Drucker. Like, I'll tell you, be honest, I was 24 straight out of college and I picked up one of his books and it was just too dense and too abstract for me. I never need this. And I picked it up during the pandemic when we all had a little bit more time to read. I'm like, holy smokes, why didn't I read this before? But I found that you referring to Peter Drucker, but more importantly, D. Hawk. And I feel like he's one of
Peter Drucker, of course, is extraordinary for his clarity of thought, understanding like what to do. Many of the ideas that inform, for example, 360-degree feedback and all of that, you could actually trace to Peter Drucker's writing. Is simply extraordinary. D. Hawk is another person who actually, well, D. Hawk is very different because he was the CEO of a company. And what is striking about D. Hawk is he, as built Visa, was responsible for that in many ways. But what was kind of interesting was how much he believed in decentralized, because he just kind of really understood decentralization. And he even came up with a new term. I don't know whether you recall that, TJ. He called it chaotic.
yes,
CHAORDIC.
yeah.
And it was kind of fascinating, this mix of chaos and kind of order. He understood immediately that that's kind of what you need for innovation. You need order to do the routine things to keep the business going. But on the other hand, you need a little bit of chaos. But you don't want chaos in the sense of disorder. You want kind of chaos which is within some kind of constrained range, if you will. And that was what he was kind of aiming for. So absolutely, he really foresaw a lot of what went in organizations. And, one of the lines I kind of like about him is, how he talks about the four beasts that devour the keeper. ego, avarice, envy, ambition. And part of what he said is you got to keep those beasts caged. And one way in which you do that is through decentralization. Because in a centralized operation, it's kind of hard to cage these beasts. And so that's the reason we were certainly drawn to DHawk, and I'd urge more people to pay attention to the idea of chaotic systems and DHawk.
Yeah, it was one of those things where when I first started reading D-Hawk, I'm like, because I read his book again during the pandemic, and then I'm like, why haven't more people heard about what he tried to do?
Yeah.
And you don't really think about what he did at Visa until you realize that
Well,
decentralization is hard.
yeah, the irony is people who create decentralized structures realize it's not about them. See, D-Hawk certainly wasn't a charismatic kind of individual. So the irony is people who create centralized organizations get a lot more attention, like the Elon Musks of the world.
Yeah.
So the D-Hawks don't get attention because what the D-Hawks do is the D-Hawks of the world are system builders, and they're not empire builders.
That's a good distinction. So then that also explains why he's kind of an unsung hero of decentralization.
Right.
He built a system. Everybody knows who Visa is, but hardly anybody knows who DHawk is.
Right, exactly. That's exactly.
And so he conquered his demons, unlike.
Indeed, he did.
Yeah, unlike Elon Musk or some of the others that you probably know better than I do. I do want to talk about active listening. One of the things that I've really enjoyed about our conversation, be it when we ran into each other at an airport in New York, or when I visited Stanford, or when I've been driven, is the fact that you're really great at active listening. You're listening and looking for cues, both spoken and unspoken. Active listening as a tool for friction fixing. Let's talk about that a little bit.
So I can only talk about, let me begin rather by talking about my personal experience. Active listening implies that you need to do a bunch of things on your own. So for example, when I teach executives, I never prepare myself. And the reason I don't prepare myself is I have to listen to them even more carefully. Because I've got 30 slides and I want to march through the slides. Am I going to listen to anybody? But if I go in there and just screw the slides, what are they interested in? And then you listen to them. What you also have is the benefit that each class becomes different. You're not repeating the same thing over and over again. So there's variation there, but you have to listen in different ways to people. So, for example, with my MBA students, I'm like way more prepared in the class because, it's a very different social system and so on and so forth. And you got 80 minutes and you got to do a bunch of things and it's a course and there's an exam and, all these kinds of things. But even with them, part of what you want to do is you want to listen to them and then you want to ask them questions. So I won't use names. Some time ago, I was talking with a student and, he'd done a startup and, it was growing, but at 8%. And he's a very smart person, but it wasn't growing at 30%. And he's like frustrated. And, he liked building the company, but obviously hated losing. And, he came and talked to me about a pivot. And, he said, what do you think? And I asked him a bunch of questions and I'm listening to him. But at the end, as he was leaving, I said, you're a very unusual student. And he said, how come? I said, you're the only person who I know is doing 2 startups at the same time. That's kind of a difficult thing to do, I told him. And he looks at me and he says, what's the other startup? And I looked at this young man and said, aren't you getting married soon? And he looked at me and he said, but she's completely behind me. I said, does she have actually an option to tell you she thinks this is a nutty idea? What's she going to tell you? That she's all in. So ask yourself, which startup do you want to succeed? Where is it you want to invest your time and energy? Because doing a startup means what? Essentially, you're married to the startup. That's what it is.
Right.
And the question is not whether you want to be married to the startup, but when. And is now the time. And so that's a different kind of listening is the point I'm trying to make.
You also answered another question I had, because I actually had this question the last time we met, which was last year in Stanford, where you were just coming off an 80-minute code teaching session, and talking for 80 minutes in front of that audience will be exhausting and I don't want to talk to anybody else. And you were still full of energy. You were like driving, we were having our usual spirited conversations. And part of that, I just want to know what's the secret sauce? Like, how do you prepare for marathons like what you do? It's just like years, decades of teaching now.
But, so remember, of course, you're investing energy, but you're also getting energy too. So which is why, for example, I don't like to teach in programs where I'm kind of being completely translated. Because I don't know what's going on in the heads of people. I don't have like a bilateral connection. There's always this translator and the lag. And so when there's all this translation involved, I prefer not to do it. Because it's hard to establish that connection, right? And get that energy. Like, are they getting it? Like, So I'm always worried about translation. One of my colleagues told a great story about translators. And I should tell you this because I won't mention the name of this wonderful colleague. He's left Stanford since and moved on to other things. Apparently, when he was teaching in an executive program, I think it was a group of executives from China. And, he loves to crack mischievous jokes and so on and so forth. And he sort of cracked a joke and it was duly translated and the audience responded with like laughter, rip-roaring laughter. And he instantly thought, wow, I'm hot and I'm communicating with this audience. And then after a while, he tried a second one and he got a similar enthusiastic reception. And then he said, man, I'm on fire today. It's really kind of working well with the group. And the third, then he kind of shared a couple more jokes. And at the end of it, he was talking to the translator and saying, thank you for a great job. I really felt I connected with the audience and they really, particularly gratifying that they responded to my wicked jokes. And the translator told him, Professor, minor clarification. Right before you told the joke, I was kind of telling them, hang on, the guy is telling a joke right now. And then he would tell the audience very briefly something about the joke and say, now the joke's over, better clap. You see the problem? You see the problem?
Yeah. So basically, I think the best, I would say probably the best public speaking, or which is what I feel teaching is in some way, is when the audience is engaged and you're feeding off the energy.
Yeah, and also in many ways, it also goes back to much earlier times. See, I trace all of this to my formative experience at business school at XLRI in India, where I was the debating secretary, and we would have these things called Hyde Park. So in Hyde Park, there'd be a bunch of speakers, and you had to recite or declaim Hamlet or Mark Antony or whoever. But they gave you a raincoat, a motorcycle helmet, and a tennis racket. And the audience would sit down and they'd be given rotten tomatoes. And they'd aim these tomatoes at you, and you had to fend these missile attack of tomatoes and keep on reciting. And if you paused, you lost. So that kind of like, trial by fire, if you will. So that was a wonderful thing. The other thing, which was like a fascinating practice, was we called it Just a Minute, JEST. And in Just a Minute, what would happen is you would have a contest and people would give you a topic on which you had to speak for 60 seconds, DJ. And the topic would be something you knew nothing about. So you were allowed to make as many factual errors as you wanted to, but you could not make logical errors. So like an example is they'll give you a topic like quasars, and you're thinking, Jesus, what am I going to talk about? Quasars for like 60 seconds. I know very little. But then you say quasars are ducks. And then for the rest of the 59 seconds, that's the line that you got to go through. Anytime the duck logic doesn't work, you're out, so to speak. So all the time, these were ways in which it was a wonderful form of improvisation and kind of getting you to think kind of on your feet, as they say.
Speaking of XLRI, I want to ask this question. You went to XLRI, and how do I put this? You are now part of the same comma delineated list of giants in this field of organizational research, of the very names that you probably were reading when you were in XLRI.
Oh, yeah. I always marvel at this. When I was studying at XLRI, TJ, our marketing textbook was by Phil Kotler. And I remember when I joined Kellogg, Phil was my colleague. And he was an extraordinary colleague and is an extraordinary person. And I remember telling him, I said, Phil, you have many progeny in India. He said, what do you mean? I said, when I was studying, there were people who memorized your book. Like we didn't need to read it. You'd go to the guy whom we used to call Kotler and say, hey, boss, where do we learn something on counter marketing? And he would tell you pages so and so. And then, you didn't need to do anything. These guys knew everything. So Phil was, became a colleague. Did I ever think Phil Kotler was going to be my colleague? Heck no. Ironically, on the Stanford side, three of the people became my colleagues. In finance, it was an extraordinary professor called James Van Horn, who wrote a book called The Fundamentals of Financial Management. And then there was a cost accountant called Chuck Holmgren, who wrote Cost Accounting. I believe that was one of the texts. And the other one was a text by my current and wonderful colleague, Jeffrey Pfeffer. It was then called The External Control of Organizations. I was in business school in 1980. This had been published in 1978, and it was the basis of a course, and we had to read it. And it was like, I never ever thought I would be colleagues with Jeffrey. So it's very strange how some things come to happen. And so, but you have to remember, even at XLRI, I never thought I was going to become a professor. My colleagues, my classmates would tell me, you're better off being a professor. And I also got kind of bored, to be honest with you. These courses were kind of boring, and for me at least. And so I went to the dean then, and who was a lovely man, Sudas Roy. And I said, man, I'm kind of getting bored, and maybe I'll do a PhD and maybe I should do independent study. And just then, what a random stroke of luck, we had a wonderful colleague called Jitendra Singh, wonderful professor called Jitendra Singh. We used to call him Jittu, Jittu, and he had finished his PhD at the Wharton School. And he was a student of XLRI, and he had come back to teach at XL. And the amazing thing was, I expressed interest in organizations to Jittu. And I think for like 7 months or something, basically, I kind of went through his first year PhD reading courses. So every week I had to read a book and discuss it, or read a bunch of articles and discuss it. And in those days he was single, and he would stay in the dorm in a wonderful faculty room, which was air conditioned. So we'd go in the evening, and between 6 and 7:15 or something, I'd talk about the book. And then G2 would also he had a wonderful collection of Western classical music, the records of Herbert von Karajan, whom I'd never heard before. So all of that kind of education also played a role. And we had, I remember we had like an extraordinary person, Father McGrath. I would say in all of my life, TJ, if there is one person who's come close to divinity on earth, I would say, for me, everybody has their own person. For me, it was Father Ed McGrath. I used to contribute to his charity regularly until he passed away. Ironically, he was from California, and he was like an extraordinary. He used to teach a class called Basic Managerial Skill. And we used to think, man, we are all people who have cleared big entrance exams. We can solve math problems in a jiffy, and we can do linear programming and this and that and like whatever. And what is this basic managerial skills? It sounds kind of stupid. And I still remember in the second class, we were all sitting down there. It was the morning, I think must have been like 8:15 or so. We were in a place called Enright Hall, from 50 or 60 of us, I forget the exact count. And suddenly the doors burst open of this hall. And 6 people kind of rush into the room, screaming and shouting and waving things and dressed in the strangest of clothing. And then they vanish, and we're stunned. And our immediate hypothesis is, oh my God, somebody had a party. It kind of went on for too long, and these guys don't know it's a class, and they burst into the room. And after these guys left immediately, Father McGrath gave us each a sheet of paper and said, file a complaint to the local police station. How many people were there? What clothes did they wear? What language did they use? What were they singing? What were their demands? I got to tell you, I had this sheet of paper. I was reeling with shock, and my mind was a blank. So was the mind of everybody else, utter shock. And he looked at us and he said, you guys want to be managers in a country like India?
Wow.
You don't even know what happened. You cannot even tell me what just happened. You can't even file a complaint to the cops. I mean, what is it you can do? And you kind of realize and say, oh my God. So, practical things like that kind of jolt you too, if you know what I mean.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, we had people, who made us kind of like read things. I doubt whether in other business schools you would read. Like we had a course on research methods, I remember, taught by another Wharton grad called Ossie Mascarenhas, Father Mascarenhas, smart guy, liked to dress well for a pretty stylish kind of guy, but, very curious. And I remember the very first thing is when we began in the first class, I remember, we actually, the guy comes and he's writing definitions of like what is a science, what is an art, and what is a discipline using calculus. We're like, Jesus Christ, what is all? And the book that he gave us to read was an extraordinary book. I still remember the book vividly. It was called On the Methodology and Ideology of Social Sciences by a Norwegian philosopher and professor called Johan Galtung. And it was amazing. He was getting us to read all of this, and like we just couldn't connect things together early on. But after it took a while, it really began to kind of come together, so to speak. So my point is, like in business school, we had like a very rich extracurricular life. We also had, I would say, a reasonably stimulating exposure to kind of ideas and so on and so forth. So, I mean, true, in those days, maybe nerdy people kind of got into business school, and there's some truth to that. Because you had to, study and you had to do well, and the drill.
Yeah, but I feel like regardless of whether you're a poet and quant these days, either way you're a nerd, you're just nerdy about different things. But if I was to like think about this, like yes, it's amazing. Your career's trajectory has just been amazing. But I feel like if there's a lesson to be learned here is, I see this even now when you and I talk, which is you're insanely curious about the world around you, and that curiosity just keeps you going forward. And there's not a point where you've not asked me questions or about what do I do and what do I think about these things.
Right, I mean, right, and everything the more curious you are about things, curiosity is like, I don't know, it's like, it's kind of like not search, but kind of a hunger is the way I would think about it. And it doesn't matter what it is. It's not just curiosity about like ideas about organizations. It's important to bring curiosity into the home too, right? How you cook or what you cook and why you cook and what you do. And, each dish has a story and, all of that. And like learning all of that is like a fascinating thing. Right, like right now, a book that I'm riveted by is an extraordinary book called Cumin, Camels, and Caravan. So it's about the social travel of spices.
Next for Huggy, I guess.
I don't know. And that's a good place to be. I feel I'm taking a sabbatical for the next year, which means I won't be teaching MBA classes. And, I'm sort of thinking about, what to do. And AI and work is one area where I'm kind of getting interested in. Another area where I'm getting interested in is what's the design of a good job? I gave a talk to a bunch of people at Bain on this, and it went well. And the third thing I've been kind of trying to do is it's kind of more technical, in the sense of quantitative research, is we're working on a bunch of papers having to do with the structuring of conspiracy theories in America, where we are using large language models to go through Twitter and all of that. And so, that's kind of what we're doing. So it's sort of been like a fun adventure.
That will be a powerful one to be part of. And here's what I would offer you. I know we've talked about this. I will gladly, especially when you're a sabbatical year, I will gladly show up with 5 different bottles of wine. We can sit in your backyard and we'll do wine tasting and we'll talk about it.
I think that is a delightful plan. I very much like the idea of doing that, and I very much look forward to that. And thank you, TJ, for all of your support for our book, your interest, and your generosity and your curiosity too. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Huggy. And I've learned generosity from you because you've always been so generous with your time and
No, not at all.
Thank you
Not
so
at
much.
all. Always a pleasure.
Thanks so much.